Ladies and gentlemen, when the streets of a nation begin to echo with unrest, it is not merely a political moment, it is a historic reckoning. Tel Aviv's in flames, Netanyahu on the run, is not just a headline, it is a symbol of a society pushed to the edge by decades of inequality, militarism, and failed leadership. What we are witnessing today is not chaos without cause, it is consequence without apology. And if we fail to understand that, we fail to understand history itself. Public unrest rarely explodes without warning, and what we are witnessing now is not a spontaneous reaction, but the result of years of compounding grievances. When a population feels politically ignored, economically suffocated, and socially divided, the streets become the final venue for expression. Tel Aviv, long perceived as a hub of modernity, commerce, and relative tolerance, has transformed into a stage of defiance. The image of flames in the heart of the city is not just visual shock, it is political symbolism. It announces that a threshold has been crossed, a patience exhausted, and a silence broken. The anger rising from the ground is not incidental. It is cumulative, layered by betrayal, frustration, and the erosion of trust in a leadership that claimed permanence. Benjamin Netanyahu, whose leadership has stretched across decades, dominating the Israeli political landscape to an extent that conditioned citizens to believe there were no alternatives. But political longevity is not the same as political legitimacy. When leadership becomes synonymous with stagnation, manipulation, and personal ambition, it breeds discontent even among those who once supported it. What makes the current unrest so explosive is that it comes from a cross-section of society: liberals, conservatives, youth, professionals, marginalized group, each with different reasons but a shared sense of disillusionment. People are not just protesting policies, they are protesting a political culture that has normalized crisis while denying accountability. There is an emotional charge to the unrest that cannot be dismissed as chaos or extremism. The hooks of anger have embedded deeply into public consciousness because the grievances are not abstract. They are economic realities, social tensions, and everyday struggles. Housing prices have soared beyond reach, wages have stagnated, public services have been compromised, and political corruption has become a tolerated feature rather than an exception. As these pressures collided, the myth of stability collapsed. The flames seen in the streets are not the product of a single spark, but the ignition of long, dry political kindling left untended. What many governments fail to grasp is that silence is not consent. It is often the final stage before rupture. The turning point arrives when citizens no longer believe that elections, institutions, or dialogue will address their suffering. That is when the streets speak, and they do so loudly. The appearance of unrest is often treated by authorities as disorder to be suppressed. But in reality, it is feedback that was ignored until it had no other outlet. Netanyahu's administration, by constantly centralizing power and dismissing dissent, inadvertently created the conditions for resistance to become uncontainable. There is also a psychological shift underway. Protesters are not merely reacting to events, they are reframing identity and agency. For years, fear-based narratives about external threats dominated the national discourse, allowing the government to consolidate control and deflect criticism. But internal threats, economic insecurity, inequality, democratic erosion, generate a different kind of urgency. When people begin to see that their hardships are not accidental but structural, imposed or ignored by leadership, they do not wait for permission to act. They reclaim the very public space that once symbolized order, turning it into a platform for indignation. One cannot overlook how imagery intensifies momentum. Seeing flames in Tel Aviv is more than a display of anger. It becomes a message to those in power and those watching around the world. It forces conversations that political elites tried to bury and exposes fractures they tried to conceal. The presence of unrest in such a central city communicates that even the most fortified narratives are vulnerable when public trust collapses. It is a visual declaration that the status quo is unsustainable. What adds further weight to this moment is that it has pierced generational boundaries. Younger citizens, in particular, have no loyalty to the myths that sustained older political frameworks. They are not invested in defending the reputations of leaders who have presided over stagnation. For them, the cost of inaction is higher than the risk of confrontation. Their voices carry hooks of defiance, and their actions demonstrate that the old methods of political containment no longer apply. When youth join seasoned critics in the streets, it signals not a wave but a shift, an irreversible momentum. Political leaders often assume that unrest can be dispersed, discredited, or delayed. But suppressing a movement that is born of lived struggle only deepens resolve. The current moment represents the surfacing of truths that were suppressed for too long. It is not only anger at Netanyahu, who, as an individual, it is anger at a system that allowed one man to become synonymous with power, even as that power failed to improve lives. And once people recognize that authority can be challenged, the fear that sustains that authority begins to fracture. Tel Aviv in flames is not the breakdown of society. It is the reaction of a society tired of being broken. Those in power may try to frame the unrest as disloyalty or instability, but the more honest interpretation is that it is a demand, raw, urgent, unfiltered, for leadership that serves rather than rules. The streets have become the arena where truth surfaces, and in that arena, the voice of the people has grown louder than the promises of the political elite. Political power often projects an illusion of permanence until the moment it shatters. Benjamin Netanyahu, who, once a dominant and seemingly immovable figure in Israeli politics, is now confronted by a collapse of legitimacy that no speech, coalition, or legal maneuver can disguise. His fall is not sudden. It is the cumulative unraveling of authority built on division, personal ambition, and the calculated use of crisis. The image of a leader on the run is not just literal. It is metaphorical, psychological, and political. He is running from accountability, from public rage, and from a legacy that has started to consume its creator. The hooks of this moment sink deep because political collapse is most dramatic when it happens to someone who believed himself untouchable. Netanyahu, whose career has been defined by a talent for political survival, scandal after scandal, election after election, coalition after collapse, he remained. But survival tactics are not governance, and delay is not resolution. Over the years, he mastered the art of distraction, employing fear, nationalism, and geopolitical tension as shields against critique. These tools kept him afloat, but they did nothing to address the core issues facing the nation. Eventually, a leader cannot outrun the truth that people are living with daily: economic inequity, political alienation, and institutional decay. When public faith erodes, legitimacy follows, and once it starts to fall, it collapses quickly. What makes this moment especially volatile is the loss of control over the narrative. Netanyahu, who spent years shaping public opinion through media influence, party loyalty, and the manufactured image of indispensability. But political narratives crack when the people writing them lose credibility. As protests surge and dissent becomes mainstream rather than marginal, Netanyahu, who is no longer seen as a protector of the nation, but as the embodiment of its paralysis. His name, once equated with strength and continuity, is now whispered with accusation and fatigue. The same public that once tolerated his dominance is no longer willing to carry its weight. Legal scrutiny only sharpens the sense of political decline. Allegations of corruption, bribery, and abuse of power have followed him for years. What once appeared to be a series of isolated cases now forms a pattern, a portrait of governance twisted to serve personal interest. These charges do not exist in isolation. They erode the moral authority a leader needs to govern in moments of crisis. The public may endure economic hardship or security threats, but they do not easily forgive leaders who treat power as a private asset. Netanyahu, whose legal entanglements have become inseparable from his political identity, and that association has damaged him more than any single policy failure. The collapse of loyalty within his own ranks amplifies the spectacle. Political allies who once defended him now distance themselves to preserve their own futures. Cabinet members, coalition partners, and influential figures within his party are reading the political winds. When a leader's inner circle starts to fracture, it signals not only vulnerability but inevitability. Those who once reinforced his image of strength are now quietly positioning themselves for a post-Netanyahu reality. Power does not disappear in silence. It is abandoned in stages, and we are witnessing those stages unfold in real time. The international dimension adds another layer of pressure. World leaders, once cautious in their criticism, are increasingly vocal or diplomatically distant. Netanyahu, whose long-standing strategy of leveraging foreign alliances to boost domestic standing, is losing its effectiveness. Global observers are aware that instability at the top affects regional dynamics, and as his influence wanes, so does his ability to negotiate, persuade, or intimidate on the world stage. When international credibility erodes, domestic confidence follows closely behind. Yet perhaps the greatest threat to his standing is the shift in public perception. The people are no longer reacting to policies. They are reacting to a persona that has outstayed its legitimacy. Netanyahu, whose brand of leadership relied on exceptionalism, the belief that he alone could navigate security threats, foreign relations, and internal divisions. But exceptionalism cannot mask exhaustion. The hooks of public sentiment have turned sharp, and the frustration once spoken in private is now shouted in the streets. A leader loses power not when he leaves office, but when the people stop believing he should remain. As flames illuminate Tel Aviv, they cast a harsh light on his political isolation. Authority that was once imposed is now challenged, questioned, and rejected. The crowds are not merely calling for reform, they are declaring an end to the era of impunity. Netanyahu, who is not being pushed from power by a rival, but by the slow, relentless dismantling of trust. When legitimacy collapses, it does not ask permission. It arrives like a storm, tearing apart whatever claimed permanence. The man who once commanded fear now inspires defiance, and that transition is the last stage before departure. In the end, leadership is not measured by how long one holds power, but by how power ends. Netanyahu, who is not just facing opposition, he is facing reckoning. When the public no longer sees a leader at the helm, but a fugitive from responsibility, the story has already changed. And in politics, once the story changes, the outcome is no longer a question of if, but when. Economic pressure does not erupt overnight, it builds slowly, tightening around everyday life until frustration becomes fury. In Tel Aviv and across Israel, the cost of living has climbed beyond the reach of ordinary people, while wages fail to keep pace. Families who once managed to get by now find themselves sinking under rent, food expenses, and basic necessities. What makes this moment explosive is not just the hardship itself, but the perception that the government has ignored, minimized, or profited from it. When a nation's economic system stops working for its people, the people stop working within its boundaries. That is when streets ignite, not with accident, but with intent. For years, housing prices in Tel Aviv have soared to levels unmatched in most of the world. Young professionals, students, and working families are locked out of homeownership, forced into small rentals with costs that eat away at their income. The promise of upward mobility has dissolved into the reality of survival. What was once described as a temporary economic strain has become a permanent condition, and with each passing year, the burden has grown heavier. Netanyahu, whose administration claimed economic success, but that narrative overlooked the millions left behind by policies favoring the wealthy, investors, and political insiders. Inequality has become one of the most visible fractures in the social fabric. A small elite, many of them tied to political power, accumulates wealth and influence, while the middle and lower classes carry the weight of taxes, inflation, and unstable job markets. The public has not failed to notice that austerity is never demanded of those in office or those who fund them. The anger in the streets is sharpened by the sense that sacrifice is extracted from the bottom to protect the top. When the gap between privilege and reality widens too far, resentment turns into collective resistance. Corruption has only intensified the economic discontent. Scandals involving misuse of public funds, favoritism in government contracts, and political appointments based on loyalty rather than competency have fueled a perception that the economy is not broken by accident. It has been engineered in favor of a few. Citizens do not merely feel neglected, they feel exploited. The hooks of economic betrayal cut deep because they touch every element of daily existence: food, housing, education, and health care. When leadership is seen as feeding off the system rather than fixing it, the public's tolerance collapses. Another aggravating factor is the erosion of public services. Hospitals face shortages, schools lack resources, and transportation systems strain under neglect. At the same time, military spending continues to rise, justified through the constant invocation of external threats. People have begun to ask why an economy capable of funding occupation, expansion, and surveillance cannot provide affordable housing or a fair wage. That question is no longer whispered. It is shouted, painted on signs, and carried into the streets as a challenge to the legitimacy of the state's financial priorities. The workforce itself is restless. Younger generations, burdened with high living costs and uncertain futures, are no longer willing to accept the narrative that economic struggle is a rite of passage. They are demanding something previous generations hesitated to assert: a system that serves them, not one that uses them. The protest is not simply about lack of money. It is about stolen possibility. The belief that hard work guarantees stability has been replaced with the understanding that the system has no intention of keeping that bargain. Add to this the global economic climate, which has amplified domestic pressures. Inflation, supply chain issues, and shifting labor markets have taken a toll worldwide, but in Israel, these external stresses collided with internal mismanagement. A government that once used geopolitical tensions to distract from economic failure now finds that tactic losing its power. People are no longer diverted by rhetoric when hunger, housing insecurity, and debt are at their doorstep. Economic pain has become more persuasive than political narrative. The unrest we see now is not random. It is the logical outcome of long ignored reality. People do not set fires in the streets because they lack patience. They do it because patience was exhausted by policies that enriched the few and impoverished the many. Economic inequality is not an abstract idea. It is a lived experience with consequences that cannot be delayed indefinitely. Netanyahu, whose administration could postpone accountability through propaganda, alliances, and legal maneuvering. But no leader can indefinitely silence the outcry of those who can no longer afford to live. When economic strain becomes the loudest voice in the nation, political authority begins to fracture. The government may attempt to portray the protests as disruptive, but what is truly disruptive is the normalization of hardship. The flames in Tel Aviv are not sparked by chaos, they are fueled by arithmetic. People have calculated the cost of obedience and found it too high. They have recognized that their suffering is not a byproduct of necessity, but a result of leadership choices. The hook that drives this moment is clear and sharp. When a government stops serving the economic needs of its citizens, it loses the right to claim their loyalty. And once that loyalty is withdrawn, authority no longer rests on law or tradition. It is stripped down to exposure. That is the reality Netanyahu is facing. Economic anger has transformed into political fire, and no barricade can hold back a population that knows it has already paid the price of silence. For years, the shield of national security has been one of Netanyahu, Netanyahu's most powerful instruments. It was the language used to justify controversial policies, suppress dissent, and shift attention away from internal failures. The narrative was simple and effective. External threats were existential, and unity under his leadership was essential. Critics were painted as naive, disloyal, or dangerous, but security rhetoric, no matter how forceful, cannot indefinitely disguise domestic cracks. When the public looks inward and sees a system deteriorating from within, economically, socially, and politically, the message of fear loses its bite. That is exactly what is happening now. The tactics that once silenced debate are failing to silence outrage. The public has grown tired of being lectured about external enemies while internal inequality festers. The constant invocation of national danger once created cohesion. Now it creates skepticism. People are asking pointed questions. How is there always money for military expansion, but not for housing? How can security demands justify surveillance and repression, yet fail to produce safety in daily life? When fear becomes a reflexive political tool rather than a reflection of genuine threat, it stops being persuasive and starts being resented. The hook here is direct. When leaders use national security to protect themselves rather than the public eventually sees the difference. Netanyahu, who mastered the art of framing criticism as a threat to the state. Anyone challenging his authority was portrayed as weakening Israel from within. But protests in Tel Aviv reveal that the public is no longer intimidated by such framing. The anger has grown too large to be contained by slogans or accusations. People have realized that demanding transparency, reform, and economic justice is not a danger to the nation. It is a demand to save it from political decay. When citizens begin to separate their identity from their leadership, the leadership loses its monopoly on patriotism. The military-focused narrative has also worn thin because it does not reflect lived reality. Citizens do not experience security. When wages stagnate, healthcare declines, and housing becomes inaccessible. They do not feel protected when corruption cases rise and public services deteriorate. The government may point to borders and threats beyond them, but the people are looking at their neighborhoods, their rent bills, their children's schools. They are no longer convinced that external defense excuses internal neglect. National security loses credibility when it is used as camouflage for domestic failure. What adds to the collapse of this rhetoric is that even soldiers, veterans, and families connected to the military are among the critics. The old assumption that invoking security automatically rallies the public no longer holds. Younger generations, especially, are questioning the cost of endless militarization when the social contract is broken. They are not rejecting defense. They are rejecting the exploitation of defense as a political shield. This shift is powerful because it undermines the emotional stronghold that leaders like Netanyahu, who have relied on for decades. Within political circles, the security card once served as a unifying force, silencing rivals and consolidating coalitions. Today, it exposes division. Those who continue to cling to it appear out of touch, defensive, or self-serving. Even international observers see the cracks. Allies who once echoed Israeli leadership's security framing now express concern over democratic backsliding and social unrest. The narrative that once commanded global sympathy now invites scrutiny. Diplomats and analysts understand that instability is not only born at borders, it is born at home. The erosion of this rhetoric also exposes the personal nature of Netanyahu's governance. He positioned himself as the indispensable guardian of national safety, implying that without him, chaos would rise. Yet chaos is rising not in his absence, but under his tenure. That contradiction is too glaring to ignore. When the protector becomes the source of instability, the spell is broken. The public is not fleeing from his warnings. They are running toward the truth those warnings tried to bury. Media narratives have shifted as well. Outlets that once echoed security justifications now discuss economic disparity, corruption trials, and public fury. Commentators who avoided direct criticism now dissect the consequences of prioritizing power over policy. This change in tone accelerates the unraveling of the old message. A government that survives on repetition cannot survive when repetition stops working. The greatest hook in this moment is clarity. People are no longer confused about why their lives are difficult. They no longer see opposition as betrayal or protest as destabilizing. They see a leadership class that has weaponized fear to maintain control, and they are rejecting that weapon. The words that once commanded silence now spark defiance. The insistence on external threat no longer overshadows the internal crisis consuming daily life. Netanyahu, who built his political persona on the premise that only he could defend the nation, now the public is defending itself from the consequences of his governance. The failure of his security narrative is not just a communication failure. It is a collapse of the psychological contract that kept him in power. Once people stop believing that authority keeps them safe, they stop granting it the right to lead. And that is the point Israel has reached. The world is not watching this unrest from a distance. It is dissecting it, reacting to it, and drawing conclusions that extend far beyond Israel's borders. When Tel Aviv burns and Netanyahu, who appears cornered, the international community does not see an isolated flare-up. It sees a signal that long-suppressed tensions have reached a breaking point. Global media outlets, analysts, and political leaders are recalibrating their tone, no longer content with the scripted language of strategic alliances. The hooks are deep because the crisis exposes contradictions that world powers have ignored for years. How can a nation present itself as stable, democratic, and secure, while its own citizens fill the streets in revolt? Foreign governments once quick to defend Netanyahu's positions are now exercising caution. The images circulating globally have reshaped the conversation. Diplomatic partners understand that public perception matters, and the spectacle of unrest weakens the credibility of any leader who claims control. Even allies that stood by Netanyahu, who during legal controversies and military escalations now view him as a political liability. Their support, once vocal and unwavering, has cooled into silence or carefully worded concern. Silence from allies is not neutrality, it is distance. International media is amplifying the story in ways the government cannot contain. News outlets across Europe, the United States, and the Middle East are framing the unrest not as fringe agitation, but as a societal uprising. Commentators discuss the protests not in terms of disorder, but as a referendum on Netanyahu's leadership. When global headlines replace words like defender and strategist with indicted, embattled, and discredited, the shift is not cosmetic, it is consequential. The world begins to see not a leader under siege, but a leader whose time has expired. Human rights organizations, long vocal about policy decisions under Netanyahu's tenure, now find renewed leverage. The unrest validates the warnings they issued about authoritarian drift, democratic erosion, and social inequality. Their statements gain traction in foreign parliaments, editorial boards, and international courts. What was once dismissed as ideological criticism now reads as prophetic observation. And when human rights groups gain ground in global discourse, governments start adjusting their diplomatic posture. Economic and geopolitical interests are also in play. Investors and foreign policy strategists understand that unrest in Tel Aviv signals instability at the core of a key regional power. Markets respond not to speeches but to volatility, and the sight of mass protest, police clashes, and political isolation rattles confidence. Countries that rely on Israel for intelligence, cooperation, trade, or regional balancing are reassessing their long-term strategies. No nation wants to be tied too closely to a leader who may not survive the political storm. The regional dimension adds another layer. Neighboring states, adversaries, and allies alike observe this moment with strategic calculation. For opponents of Israeli policy, Netanyahu's weakening grip appears as an opening. For Arab states that recently normalized relations, there is hesitation. Will new agreements remain stable if the leadership collapses? For Western governments, the question shifts from how to support Netanyahu to how to manage what comes next. The unrest has turned leadership from a fixed variable to an unknown factor, and uncertainty always forces new calculations. There is also a moral pressure unfolding on the global stage. Democratic nations cannot continue to champion Israel's leadership abroad while ignoring a domestic population in revolt. Public opinion in those countries is increasingly shaping political policies, and voters are less willing to accept double standards. As protests grow louder, foreign leaders know that embracing Netanyahu, who publicly risks backlash at home, political self-interest will always dictate diplomacy, and right now, that interest leans away from a leader losing the confidence of his own citizens. Global academics, analysts, and think tanks are reframing the crisis not as internal turmoil, but as a tipping point in Israeli society. Publications and policy forums discuss what a post-Netanyahu era might look like, who could replace him, and whether deep reforms will follow. When the international conversation starts planning beyond a leader, that leader has already lost one of the most important forms of legitimacy, relevance. Netanyahu, who built his foreign image on the illusion of control over policy, over narrative, over opposition. But when the streets erupt and the world takes note, that illusion is no longer exportable. Diplomats can no longer cite strength where they see desperation. International confidence is a currency, and his reserves are running out. The hook that drives global attention is unavoidable. When a leader cannot contain dissent at home, the world begins to wonder whether he can be trusted to lead abroad. Netanyahu, who is no longer seen simply as embattled, he is seen as unstable. And instability is contagious in the eyes of international observers. Allies step back, critics push forward, and the global narrative shifts from support to speculation. What the world is witnessing is not merely unrest, but a referendum on a political model. And once international perception turns, it rarely turns back. Moments of political upheaval do not simply tear down, they reveal what has been hidden and force nations to confront what they have avoided. The turmoil unfolding now is not just a reaction to leadership, but a profound reflection of what the public wants the future to be. When the streets fill not with isolated protesters, but with citizens from every demographic, the message is unmistakable. This is a demand not for adjustment, but for transformation. The unrest signals that people are no longer willing to accept a political order that recycles power while ignoring consequence. They are not waiting for permission to imagine something new. They are insisting on it with urgency. The notion that Israeli democracy is resilient simply because it has survived previous crises is being challenged in real time. Resilience without reform is performance, not progress. The public has reached a point where elections are no longer seen as a sufficient tool for accountability, especially when the same political dynamics reproduce the same failures. Citizens are questioning not only the faces in office, but the structure that enables those faces to cling to power while evading responsibility. That questioning marks the beginning of a political shift, even if its direction is not yet fully defined. Public demonstrations are no longer limited to partisan divides. Voices from across the political spectrum, including those who once voted for Netanyahu, are now united in frustration. This convergence exposes a deeper truth. When leadership erodes legitimacy, ideology becomes secondary to survival. The old labels, left, right, centrist, lose their power when the crisis affects everyone. Those in power can no longer dismiss dissent as opposition, driven or fringe-led. The people in the streets are not just protesting a person, they are rejecting an era. One of the most significant shifts is generational. Younger Israelis have grown up in a political climate dominated by Netanyahu and his policies. They have watched corruption investigations drag on without resolution, seen affordable housing disappear, and experienced a cost of living that swallows opportunity. Unlike older generations, they have no nostalgia for what his leadership once represented. They do not speak in the language of loyalty, but in the language of change. Their presence in the streets forces the question, can a political system built in the past meet the expectations of a future that refuses to wait? The unrest also brings institutional weakness into sharp focus. When the judiciary, media, and legislative bodies become battlegrounds for political self-preservation rather than public service, trust collapses. People begin to view institutions not as guardians of democracy, but as extensions of political power. This loss of faith is not abstract. It is visible in how citizens talk about the system, respond to authority, and refuse to tolerate dismissive governance. The idea that a nation can maintain democratic identity while its foundational institutions bend under pressure is being openly challenged. There is also a growing recognition that accountability must extend beyond individuals to the mechanisms that protected them. Netanyahu, who may be the face of the crisis, but he is not its only architect. Years of coalition, trading, policy stagnation, and fear-based politics have produced a political culture that many now reject. Protesters are not waiting for a new face to emerge. They are demanding a shift in how power is held and how leaders are measured. The hook in this moment is unmistakable. If democracy is to survive, it cannot continue to operate on the assumptions that created the crisis. International pressure is accelerating the push for change. As allies question Netanyahu's viability and credibility, Israelis understand that global perception influences domestic reality. When leaders lose respect abroad, it weakens their leverage at home. But more importantly, it exposes citizens to the idea that political transformation is not only possible, but necessary. External scrutiny reinforces internal resolve. The current upheaval may not yet have a single leader or unified direction, but it does not need one to be powerful. Movements that reshape nations rarely begin with order. They begin with defiance. What is unfolding is the rejection of political inevitability. The belief that one man, one ideology, or one system must define the national future is being dismantled in real time. Every chant, every march, every banner declares that the people no longer consent to governance without accountability. The most important shift is psychological. Fear, once the strongest asset of the ruling class, is losing its grip. People who lose faith in leadership often hesitate to act, but people who lose fear begin to move. The protests are fueled not only by anger, but by the understanding that silence has cost more than resistance ever could. That change in mindset is irreversible. In this moment, Israel stands not at the edge of collapse, but at the edge of decision. The public is not merely reacting to failure. It is attempting to build beyond it. And when a nation reaches that point, no leader, no matter how entrenched, can stop the tide of change. So as we watch these events unfold, let us be clear-eyed. This is not random unrest. It is organized outrage. It is not the fall of a man. It is the rise of a moment. Tel Aviv's in flames, Netanyahu, who on the run, is not an end. It is a warning, a lesson, and perhaps an opening for something new. History has a way of catching up to those who believe they can outrun consequence. And when it does not knock, it kicks the door in.